Imagine a quiet suburban street where nothing unusual ever happens, until one fateful afternoon changes everything. When a young girl is locked in the basement, it seems like a simple punishment, but the truth behind the locked door will unravel a web of secrets, lies, and betrayals that no one could have expected. What did her mother hear outside that terrified her so much? Who or what is coming for this family? Stay tuned, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. The Bennetts lived in a modest two-story home in Charleston, South Carolina, a neighborhood lined with manicured lawns and picket fences. Sarah Bennett, a single mother, was known for her stern demeanor, running her household with an iron will. Her daughter, 11-year-old Emily, was a spirited and curious girl who often clashed with her mother's rigid rules. On this particular sunny afternoon, their usual arguments took an unexpected turn. "Emily, how many times do I have to ask you to clean up? The broom is sitting right there." Sarah's voice echoed sharply through the kitchen as she stood over the sink, hands trembling slightly. "I'm doing my homework," Emily replied stubbornly, her eyes glued to a book. "No, you're avoiding responsibility," Sarah said, her tone icy. "Go to the basement. Maybe some quiet time will help you think about your attitude." The basement had always been a point of contention in the household. Unlike the dusty, dark spaces most people imagined, theirs was a peculiar sanctuary, a mix of cluttered boxes, childhood toys, and a cozy nook with books and snacks. It was what Sarah called the calm room. But this time, Emily sensed something different about her mother's insistence. There was a sharp edge in Sarah's tone, and as Emily reluctantly descended the stairs, the sound of the lock clicking behind her sent a chill down her spine. At first, Emily thought it was another one of her mother's harsh lessons in discipline. She leafed through a book from a nearby shelf, trying to shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. Then, she heard it, a muffled thud from above, followed by hurried footsteps and what sounded like a gasp. Upstairs, Sarah stood frozen near the back door, staring out into the yard. Something or someone had moved in the shadows of the large oak tree. She thought she caught the glint of eyes watching her. Without thinking, she bolted the basement door, grabbed her phone, and stepped cautiously into the backyard. Her breath caught as she scanned the lawn. It looked empty, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She glanced at the neighbor's fence, the overgrown bushes along the side yard, and the shed in the corner. Something had been there. She was sure of it. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the rustle of leaves in the wind. Back in the basement, Emily had stopped reading. The muffled noises above her had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. She tried the door handle, but it was firmly locked. Frustrated, she began pacing the room, her eyes scanning the familiar space for some distraction. That's when she noticed it, an envelope tucked between the pages of an old book on the highest shelf. She climbed onto a chair to reach it, her heart racing with curiosity. The envelope was yellowed with age, the seal long broken. Inside, there were 2 folded letters. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, and rushed. The first letter read, "Sarah, you can't run forever. We know what you did. The truth always comes out." Emily's stomach churned. Who would write such a thing to her mother? What truth? The second letter was even more cryptic. "If you think locking it away will erase the past, you're wrong. You'll pay for what you've done." Emily's fingers trembled as she stuffed the letters back into the envelope, unsure of what to make of them. She knew her mother had secrets. Everyone did. But these letters hinted at something darker, something that didn't fit the image of the strong, albeit strict, woman Sarah portrayed. Hours passed before Sarah finally unlocked the door. Her face was pale, her eyes darting around as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the shadows. "Are you okay, Mom?" Emily asked hesitantly, clutching the envelope behind her back. "Yes," Sarah replied quickly, her voice too tight. "Did you hear anything while you were down here?" "No," Emily lied. "Good." Sarah's gaze lingered on Emily for a moment before she turned away. "Go finish your homework." Emily's mind raced as she climbed the stairs. She couldn't shake the feeling that her mother's paranoia was connected to the letters she'd found. She decided she needed answers, but Sarah was clearly not in a state to provide them. That night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, Emily crept back to the basement. She needed to see if there was more. Her flashlight swept over the shelves and the old boxes stacked in the corners. She rifled through photo albums, receipts, and faded postcards, finding nothing significant, until her light caught a name scrawled on the inside of a dusty box lid: Leonard. Inside the box was a single photograph. It showed a younger version of her mother, standing beside a man and a large lion. The next morning, Emily confronted her mother. "Who's Leonard?" she asked, holding up the photograph. Sarah's face turned white as she snatched the photo from Emily's hand. "Where did you find this?" "In the basement," Emily admitted. "What does it mean? Why won't you tell me what's going on?" "It's none of your business," Sarah snapped, her voice sharp and defensive. "Stay out of the basement. Do you understand?" But Emily couldn't let it go. As her mother stormed out of the room, Emily knew she'd stumbled upon something big, something her mother was desperate to keep hidden. That evening, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table staring at the photo, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering, her hands trembling. "You can't ignore this forever," a deep voice said on the other end. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah replied, though her voice betrayed her fear. "Oh, but you do. Leonard is just the beginning." The line went dead. Sarah dropped the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She didn't notice Emily watching from the shadows, her heart pounding as she tried to piece together the fragments of the mystery. Who was Leonard? What was her mother running from? And most importantly, who had called and what did they want? The days following the mysterious phone call were tense. Sarah became increasingly paranoid, jumping at every noise and double-checking the locks on the doors and windows. Emily, ever observant, noticed the dark circles under her mother's eyes and the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. Something was haunting her mother, and Emily was determined to find out what. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Emily returned home from school to find the house eerily quiet. Normally, Sarah would be in the kitchen or organizing her ever-growing stack of mail. But today, the air felt heavy. "Mom," Emily called out, setting her backpack down by the door. No response. The basement door was ajar, a faint glow of light spilling out. Her heart thudded in her chest as she approached. Her mother had been adamant, "Stay out of the basement." But curiosity gnawed at Emily. What was so important down there? She crept down the wooden stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The air was cool and carried a faint musty smell. As she reached the bottom, she saw Sarah sitting in the far corner of the room, her head in her hands. On the floor beside her was an old wooden box, its lid wide open, and scattered around her were papers, photographs, and what looked like a tarnished gold locket. "Mom," Emily's voice was soft, almost afraid to disturb her. Sarah looked up sharply, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. "What are you doing down here?" she snapped, hurriedly gathering the papers into a pile. "I heard a noise," Emily lied. "What is all this?" "It's nothing," Sarah said, her tone final. She shoved the papers back into the box and snapped the lid shut. "You shouldn't be down here." Emily hesitated. She wanted to ask about the photo of the lion, the strange letters, and the phone call. But the look on her mother's face, a mixture of fear and anger, stopped her. Instead, she turned and went back upstairs, her mind spinning with questions. That night, Sarah paced the kitchen, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She glanced at the clock. 11:30 p.m. She had made a decision, one she had been avoiding for years. She dialed a number she hadn't used in over a decade. The line rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Sarah?" "Hi, Arthur," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." The next morning, Emily woke to the sound of voices downstairs. She tiptoed to the top of the stairs and peered down. A man she didn't recognize stood in the kitchen with her mother. He was tall, with graying hair and a weathered face. His presence felt heavy, almost foreboding. "I told you this would come back to haunt us," the man said, his voice low but filled with frustration. "You should have told her the truth years ago." "I was trying to protect her," Sarah replied, her voice breaking. "She's not a child anymore, Sarah. You can't keep running." Emily's heart raced. Who was this man? What truth was he talking about? She leaned in closer, trying to catch more of the conversation. "You don't understand, Arthur," Sarah said. "If they find out—" "They already know," Arthur interrupted. "That's why I'm here. We need to deal with this together." The sound of a chair scraping against the floor made Emily retreat to her room. Moments later, she heard the front door close. She looked out her window just in time to see the man walking down the driveway, his shoulders hunched against the wind. Over the next few days, Sarah's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She began sorting through old boxes, shredding papers, and burning photographs in the fireplace. Emily watched in silence, the unease growing inside her. One evening, as Sarah was busy in the living room, Emily seized the opportunity to return to the basement. She needed to know what her mother was hiding. She rifled through the boxes until she found the one her mother had been looking through. Inside, she found a stack of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Most of them were addressed to Sarah, but one caught Emily's attention. It was addressed to Arthur Miller. The letter was dated over a decade ago and read, "Arthur, I can't stay here any longer. The truth is too dangerous, and I can't risk Emily finding out. I'm leaving Charleston for good. Don't try to find me, Sarah." Emily's hands shook as she folded the letter. Who was Arthur? Why had her mother left Charleston? And what was the truth she was so desperate to hide? The next day, Emily decided to confront her mother. "Who's Arthur?" she asked, holding up the letter. Sarah froze, her face draining of color. "Where did you get that?" "In the basement," Emily said. "I want answers, Mom. Who is he? And why were you writing to him?" Sarah sank into a chair, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Arthur is someone I knew a long time ago," she said carefully. "We worked together at the place I used to live." "The place with Leonard?" Emily asked, watching her mother's reaction closely. Sarah's eyes widened. "You've been going through my things? You're not telling me anything." Emily shot back. "I found the photo of you with the lion. I found the letters. And I heard you on the phone the other night. What's going on, Mom? Why are you so scared?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond but was interrupted by a loud knock at the door. They both froze. "Stay here," Sarah whispered, getting up and moving toward the door. Emily followed, peeking around the corner as her mother opened the door to reveal a woman in a dark coat. "Hello, Sarah," the woman said, her tone cold. "It's been a long time." Sarah stepped outside, closing the door behind her, but not before Emily caught a glimpse of the woman's sharp features and piercing eyes. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to hear their conversation. "You can't keep ignoring this," the woman said. "You knew this day would come." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah replied, but her voice wavered. "The lion wasn't the only thing you took," the woman hissed. "You have until the end of the week to come clean or I will." Emily's mind raced. What had her mother taken? And why was this stranger so determined to bring it up now? As the woman walked away, Sarah leaned against the door, her face etched with worry. Emily stepped back, pretending she hadn't been listening. "Who was that?" she asked innocently. "Just an old friend," Sarah said, forcing a smile. But Emily knew better. Whatever her mother was hiding, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The knock at the door had left the Bennett household shrouded in an even deeper layer of unease. Sarah's encounter with the sharp-featured stranger played on Emily's mind like a broken record. Her mother's dismissive answer, "just an old friend," was hollow. A lie so thinly veiled it only fueled Emily's growing determination to uncover the truth. For the next 2 days, Sarah barely spoke, retreating into herself as if fortifying her walls against an invisible threat. Emily, on the other hand, was bursting with questions she didn't know how to ask. She needed answers but knew Sarah wouldn't give them willingly. On the third evening, when Sarah stepped out to run an errand, Emily saw her chance. She had noticed her mother slipping a set of keys into her coat pocket earlier, But in her haste, Sarah had left the coat draped over the chair. Emily reached into the pocket and found what she suspected: a small silver key. The key looked old, with the faintest traces of rust along the edges. Emily immediately thought of the locked drawer in her mother's bedroom, one she had tried to open countless times before without success. The house was eerily quiet as Emily climbed the stairs. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stepped into her mother's room. The drawer in question was part of an antique dresser, and the key slid in effortlessly, turned with a faint click. Inside was a collection of papers, photographs, and an unmarked black envelope. Emily ignored everything else, drawn to the envelope by an almost magnetic pull. She opened it to find several folded documents, along with a single photograph. The photograph showed her mother, younger and smiling, standing beside a man Emily had never seen before. His arm was around Sarah's shoulders, and in the background was a sign: Charleston Grand Circus. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It was the man from the photograph with the lion, the same man her mother had been arguing with on the phone. She turned to the documents and found something even more shocking: a birth certificate, her own. But under father's name, it didn't say unknown, as she had always been told. Instead, it read Arthur Miller. Emily stumbled back, clutching the papers. Her head spun as questions tumbled through her mind. Arthur was her father? Why had her mother lied? And what did any of this have to do with the lion or the circus? Sarah returned home later that evening to find Emily sitting in the living room, the black envelope on the coffee table in front of her. "Mom," Emily began, her voice trembling, "I need to know the truth." Sarah froze in the doorway, her eyes locking onto the envelope. She knew immediately what Emily had found. "I told you to stay out of my things," Sarah said, her voice sharp with anger and fear. "You've been lying to me my entire life." Emily shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Arthur is my dad? Why didn't you tell me? And what is this about the circus? What are you hiding?" Sarah sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the past had finally become too much to bear. "It's not that simple," she said quietly. "Then explain it to me," Emily demanded. For a long moment, Sarah didn't speak. Then, with a deep sigh, she began. "Arthur and I met when we were both young. I was working at the circus and he was part of it too. He wasn't just a worker, though. He was the owner's son." Sarah's voice was distant, her eyes fixed on a point far away. "We fell in love, but his father didn't approve. He said I was a distraction, a liability. I was just the girl who fed the lions." Emily listened intently, her anger mingling with a growing sense of empathy. "Things got worse when Leonard escaped," Sarah continued. "Arthur's father blamed me. He said I was too soft, that I let the lion out on purpose. But that wasn't true. Leonard was being mistreated. He was in pain, and I couldn't stand to watch it anymore. I wanted to help him, but..." Her voice broke. "It all went wrong. Leonard got loose, and Arthur's father was injured trying to stop him. After that, I had to leave. Arthur wanted to come with me, but I told him no. I didn't want him to lose everything because of me." Emily's heart ached as she tried to process what her mother was telling her. "So, Arthur didn't abandon us? You left him?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I thought it was the only way to protect you. But now," she shook her head, "I don't know if I made the right choice." Before Emily could respond, there was another knock at the door. Sarah's face went pale. She motioned for Emily to stay put as she opened the door. Standing on the porch was the same sharp-featured woman from before, her expression cold and calculating. "We need to talk," the woman said. "Not now," Sarah replied, trying to shut the door, but the woman pushed her way inside. "Your secrets are catching up to you, Sarah," the woman said, her voice icy. "You can't keep running from this." Emily stood frozen, watching the confrontation. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman turned to Emily with a smirk. "Oh, she hasn't told you? How typical." She looked back at Sarah. "Should I do the honors?" "Get out," Sarah snapped. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell her the truth," the woman said. "What truth?" Emily demanded. The woman's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Emily. Your mother isn't the hero she's making herself out to be. The night Leonard escaped, someone helped her. Someone she's been protecting all these years. And that person is the reason your life has been one big lie. Stop it, Sarah shouted, her voice cracking. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, the woman said. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is proof that your mother wasn't acting alone. She had help, Arthur's help. Emily's head spun. She turned to Sarah, searching her mother's face for answers. But Sarah remained silent, her expression a mixture of fear and guilt. The woman finally left, leaving Sarah and Emily in a tense, suffocating silence. Emily stared at her mother, waiting for an explanation, but none came. Later that night, unable to sleep, Emily snuck into the kitchen and found the paper the woman had left behind. It was an old ledger, detailing payments made by the circus to various employees. At the bottom of the page was a note in Arthur's handwriting. Transfer Leonard to a sanctuary before it's too late. Emily's mind raced. Arthur had tried to save the lion, too. But why had her mother never told her this? And why had the stranger insisted that there was more to the story? As Emily stared at the paper, a single thought consumed her. What else is my mother hiding? The stranger's visit left an ominous shadow over the Bennett household. For days, Sarah barely spoke, retreating into herself. Emily tried to process the conflicting emotions surging inside her. She felt betrayed by her mother's lies, but a part of her also pitied Sarah. Clearly tormented by secrets she wasn't ready to reveal. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the ledger, Arthur's handwriting, the note about Leonard, and the stranger's cryptic accusations gnawed at her. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit, but one thing was clear. Her father had tried to save the lion, just as Sarah claimed to have done. If they'd been working together, why had her mother painted Arthur as an absentee father? One rainy afternoon, Emily waited until Sarah went out to the grocery store. She retrieved the ledger from its hiding place under her mattress and studied it again, this time searching for clues she might have missed. Her eyes landed on a name written in faded ink beside several payments. G.R. Whitaker. The name stirred something in her memory. As a child, she'd overheard Sarah arguing on the phone with someone named Whitaker. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now the name felt significant. Whoever G.R. Whitaker was, they had received large sums of money from the circus shortly before Leonard escaped. Emily decided to investigate. She started by searching through the boxes in the basement, hoping to find something that might connect Whitaker to her mother. Among stacks of old papers, she found a faded envelope marked for Sarah's eyes only. Inside was a typed letter. Sarah, you know what Whitaker did. You know what he's capable of. If you don't leave, he'll ruin you. I can't protect you forever. Arthur. Emily's hands shook as she reread the letter. Who was Whitaker? And why had Arthur been so desperate to protect Sarah from him? That evening, Emily confronted her mother again. Who's G.R. Whitaker? She asked, holding up the letter. Sarah froze, her face a mask of shock and fear. Where did you get that? It doesn't matter, Emily said. I want answers, Mom. Who is he, and why was Arthur warning you about him? Sarah sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I was hoping you'd never have to know, she said, her voice trembling. Whitaker was the owner of the circus. He was cruel, manipulative, and dangerous. He cared about money and power, nothing else. When I tried to save Leonard, he accused me of sabotage and threatened to destroy my life. Why didn't you just leave? Emily asked. I tried, Sarah said. But Whitaker wasn't the kind of man you could just walk away from. He made it clear that if I left, there would be consequences. Arthur tried to help, but it wasn't enough. Why didn't you tell me this before? Emily asked, her voice breaking. Because I wanted to protect you, Sarah said. I didn't want you growing up with the same fear I lived with. Emily's anger softened slightly, but the questions kept coming. What happened to Whitaker? Is he still alive? Sarah hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. After I left the circus, I cut all ties. I didn't want to look back. Later that night, Emily couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against her window as she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Something about her mother's story didn't sit right. If Sarah had truly cut all ties, why had the stranger mentioned Whitaker? And why was Sarah still so afraid? Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. She retrieved her laptop and began researching the Charleston Grand Circus. To her surprise, she found very little information. The circus had shut down shortly after Leonard's escape, and most of the articles about it were vague. But then she stumbled across a blog post written by a former performer. The post described Whitaker as a tyrant who ruled the circus with an iron fist. It also mentioned rumors that he had gone into hiding after being accused of embezzling funds. Emily's heart raced as she read the final line of the post. Some say Whitaker is still out there, watching and waiting for his moment to return. The next morning, Emily told Sarah what she had found. "I thought you said you didn't know what happened to Whitaker," Emily said, holding up her laptop. Sarah's face paled as she read the blog post. "I didn't know," she insisted. "I swear. I thought he was gone for good." Emily wasn't convinced. "Then why did that woman say you took something from him? What did she mean?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she stood abruptly and began pacing the room. "This is why I didn't want you involved," she muttered. "I didn't want you digging into the past." "But I am involved," Emily said. "You can't keep shutting me out, Mom. I deserve to know the truth." Sarah stopped pacing and looked at Emily with a mixture of guilt and desperation. "Fine," she said. "I'll tell you everything." Sarah sat down and began to speak, her voice heavy with emotion. "When I decided to leave the circus, I couldn't just walk away. Whitaker controlled everything, my paycheck, my housing, even my friends. But Arthur came up with a plan. He told me to take Leonard and release him at a sanctuary. He said it would send a message to Whitaker that he couldn't keep exploiting the animals. So that's what we did." Emily listened intently, her heart aching for the young woman her mother had once been. "But things didn't go as planned," Sarah continued. "Leonard escaped before we reached the sanctuary, and in the chaos, Whitaker's father was injured. Whitaker blamed me, of course, and I became his scapegoat. He threatened to ruin me if I didn't cooperate. That's when Arthur told me to leave Charleston." "And you think Whitaker's behind all of this?" Emily asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but I can't shake the feeling that he's out there, waiting to finish what he started." Emily's mind was spinning as she went to bed that night. Her mother's story was heartbreaking, but it also raised more questions. Why had Whitaker gone after Sarah so relentlessly? And why was he resurfacing now after all these years? As Emily drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but feel that the answers were closer than ever. But would she like what she found? The days after Sarah's confession passed in tense silence. Emily felt like she was living with a stranger. She had spent her whole life believing in the tough but loving mother who had always seemed so sure of everything. Now that image was crumbling, revealing a frightened woman who had been running from the shadows of her past for years. But Sarah wasn't the only one haunted. Emily couldn't shake the stranger's words. The lion wasn't the only thing you took. What had Sarah taken? And why had the woman sounded so certain that the past was about to catch up with her? One afternoon, Emily found herself staring at the old photograph of her mother and Arthur with the lion. She traced her finger over their smiling faces, trying to reconcile the happy young woman in the picture with the fearful person Sarah had become. Her gaze shifted to the background, where the words Charleston Grand Circus were painted on a weathered sign. Something about the picture felt off, but she couldn't quite place it. Determined to find answers, Emily decided to visit the library. She had already scoured the internet for information about the circus, but maybe there were old newspapers or records that could fill in the gaps. The library's archives were tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the building, where the scent of aged paper hung heavy in the air. Emily sifted through microfilm reels, her eyes scanning headlines for any mention of the circus. Most of the articles were promotional stories about the performances, the animals, and the grandeur of the show. But then she found it, a front-page headline from nearly 12 years ago. Chaos at Charleston Grand Circus. Owner injured in lion escape. Emily's heart pounded as she read the article. It described how Leonard, the circus's prized lion, had escaped during a performance, causing panic among the audience. The owner, Jeeve R. Whitaker, had been severely injured while attempting to recapture the animal. Near the end of the article, a single sentence made Emily's blood run cold. Witnesses claim Whitaker's injuries were not accidental, but no charges have been filed. When Emily returned home, she found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the telephone. "Expecting another call from your old friend?" Emily asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Sarah flinched but didn't respond. "I found an article about the lion escape," Emily continued, setting her backpack down. "It says Whitaker's injuries weren't accidental. What really happened that night?" Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "I told you what happened," she said wearily. "No, you told me part of what happened," Emily said. "You didn't tell me why people thought you hurt him." Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Because they needed someone to blame," she said. "Whitaker was a cruel man, Emily. He mistreated the animals, his employees, everyone. When Leonard escaped, he tried to stop him with a whip. I couldn't stand there and let it happen, so I intervened." "What does that mean?" Emily asked, her voice rising. Sarah hesitated. "I pulled him back. He lost his footing and fell. That's how he got hurt. But of course, he made it sound like I pushed him on purpose." Emily stared at her mother, trying to process what she was hearing. "So that's why he wanted to ruin you?" Sarah nodded. "He couldn't stand the idea of losing control. And after that night, he made it his mission to destroy me. That's why I had to leave." Emily wanted to believe her mother, but something still didn't add up. If Whitaker had been so dangerous, why hadn't Arthur done more to protect Sarah? Why had he let her leave Charleston alone? The answers came sooner than Emily expected. The next morning, as Emily walked to school, she noticed a black car parked a few houses down. At first, she thought it was just another neighbor's vehicle. But when she glanced back, she realized the car wasn't parked. It was following her. Her pulse quickened. She quickened her pace, turning down a side street, but the car turned as well. Panic set in as she realized she was being followed. She ducked into a nearby coffee shop and watched through the window as the car slowly rolled past before disappearing around the corner. When she got to school, she couldn't focus. Who was in the car? Was it Whitaker or someone else connected to the circus? That evening, Emily told Sarah about the car. "I think someone's watching us," she said. Sarah's face paled. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Emily said. "And I think it's connected to everything that's been happening." Sarah didn't respond, but the fear in her eyes spoke volumes. The following day, Sarah received another phone call. This time, Emily was ready. She picked up the phone in her room, quietly listening in on the conversation. "You're running out of time, Sarah," the voice on the other end said. "You know what we want." "I don't have it," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Liar," the voice hissed. "You took it the night Leonard escaped, and you've been hiding it ever since. If you don't hand it over, your daughter will pay the price." Emily's heart raced as she covered her mouth to stifle a gasp. She waited until the line went dead before confronting her mother. "What were they talking about?" Emily demanded. "What did you take?" Sarah tried to deny it, but Emily wouldn't back down. Finally, Sarah broke. "Fine," she said. "You want to know the truth? I took the ledgers." "The ledgers?" Emily asked, confused. "Yes," Sarah said. "The night Leonard escaped, I found proof that Whitaker was stealing money from the circus. I knew it was my only leverage, so I took them with me when I left. I thought it would keep him away, but clearly I was wrong." Emily stared at her mother, stunned. "So that's why he's been chasing you all these years? Because of some papers?" "They're not just papers," Sarah said. "They're proof of everything he's done: embezzlement, animal cruelty, bribery. If those ledgers ever came to light, it would ruin him." That night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the ledgers. If they were so important, why hadn't her mother destroyed them? And if Whitaker was desperate enough to threaten them, what else was he capable of? The next morning, Emily made a decision. She would find the ledgers herself and figure out a way to end this once and for all. She just hoped she wasn't too late. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to spiral out of control. The cryptic phone calls, the stranger at their door, and now the black car following her. It all pointed to one conclusion. They were being hunted. The revelation about the ledgers only added to the urgency. If those documents were as damning as Sarah claimed, then keeping them hidden was no longer an option. But Sarah wasn't budging. She refused to say where the ledgers were or why she hadn't used them to stop Whitaker years ago. "It's too dangerous," was all she would say. "The less you know, the safer you are." Emily was done accepting that answer. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner, Emily slipped down to the basement. Her mother rarely ventured there anymore, claiming it was too cluttered, and Emily suspected the ledgers might still be hidden among the chaos. The basement was cool and dimly lit, the single bulb casting long shadows on the walls. Emily moved methodically, checking old boxes, rummaging through stacks of papers, and even peeking behind the shelves. It was slow, tedious work, but she didn't mind. Every crinkled piece of paper and dusty photo felt like a step closer to uncovering the truth. After nearly an hour, her patience paid off. Behind a pile of old books, she found a small metal lockbox. It was heavy, the kind of weight that promised something important inside. Her hands trembled as she carried it to the workbench. She tried the key she had used to open her mother's drawer earlier, but it didn't fit. Frustrated but determined, she grabbed a screwdriver from the nearby toolbox and began prying at the lock. After several tense minutes, the latch gave way with a sharp pop. Inside were several bound notebooks, their covers worn and faded. Emily opened the first one and was immediately struck by the meticulous handwriting. The pages were filled with numbers, dates, and names, all carefully recorded. As she flipped through the pages, she began to see patterns. Payments to mysterious entities, bribes to local officials, and a startling amount of money siphoned from the circus's profits. Whitaker's name was everywhere, but what shocked her most were the occasional notations in Arthur's handwriting. Emily's stomach churned as she realized the implications. Arthur, her father, had been complicit in Whitaker's schemes, at least for a time. But then she found a page with a bold red mark across it. "Arthur is pulling out of the operation," it read. "If he talks, this whole thing falls apart." Emily's breath caught. Was this why Whitaker had come after her mother? Because Arthur had tried to expose him? Emily quickly hid the ledgers back in the box and shoved it under the workbench. She would confront Sarah later, but for now, she needed to process everything. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale as she looked down at Emily. "What are you doing?" Sarah's voice was tight, trembling with something between fear and anger. "I found them," Emily said, her voice defiant. "The ledgers. You lied to me again." Sarah descended the stairs slowly, her hands gripping the railing as if she might collapse. "You don't understand," she said. "Those ledgers are dangerous." "I think I understand perfectly," Emily said, holding up one of the notebooks. "You've been hiding this for years while Whitaker has been ruining people's lives. You could have stopped him, Mom. Why didn't you?" Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. "When I left the circus, I thought if I stayed quiet, he would leave us alone. But he didn't. He never stopped. Then why didn't you use this?" Emily demanded, shaking the ledger. "Why didn't you expose him?" "Because I was scared," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. "I was scared of what he would do to you, to Arthur, to anyone who got in his way." The raw emotion in her mother's voice gave Emily pause. For the first time, she saw the depth of Sarah's fear. Not just for herself, but for everyone she cared about. The next morning, Emily woke to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, the ledgers spread out in front of her. "I've made a decision," Sarah said, her voice steady but grim. "We're going to take these to the police." Emily felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed like they might finally have a chance to end this nightmare. But the hope was short-lived. As they were preparing to leave, the phone rang. Sarah hesitated before answering, her hand hovering over the receiver. "Don't answer it," Emily said, her voice tight, but Sarah picked up the phone. "Wise choice," a voice said on the other end. If you think running to the police will save you, think again. You know what I'm capable of, Sarah. Don't test me. The line went dead. Sarah slammed the phone down, her hands shaking. He knows, she whispered. He always knows. That evening, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. She kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the black car from before. But the street was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Around midnight, she heard a noise outside. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. She crept to her window and peered outside, her heart hammering in her chest. First, she saw nothing. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a shadow moving near the edge of the yard. She gasped and stumbled back from the window. "Mom!" she whispered urgently, rushing to Sarah's room. Sarah was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed with a baseball bat in her hands. "I heard it too," she said. "What do we do?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We wait," Sarah said, "and we stay quiet." The rest of the night passed in tense silence. By morning, the shadow was gone, but the sense of unease lingered. Sarah made coffee while Emily sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts racing. They couldn't go on like this. Something had to give. "What happens now?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. Sarah set down her mug and looked at her daughter, her expression both weary and resolute. "Now," she said, "we fight back." As Sarah began making phone calls, Emily realized this was far from over. Whitaker was still out there, and he wasn't going to let them walk away without a fight. But for the first time, Emily felt like they had a chance. A slim one, but a chance nonetheless. The past was coming for them, and it wouldn't be long before all the secrets were laid bare. The morning after the Shadow's unsettling visit, the tension in the Bennett household was nearly unbearable. Sarah and Emily sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the ledgers stacked between them like a fragile bridge of truth. The air between them was thick with unresolved questions and the weight of an impending confrontation. Sarah's plan to take the ledgers to the police sounded straightforward, but Emily knew better. Whitaker wasn't just a threat to them. He was a master manipulator who had evaded justice for years, and now it seemed he was watching their every move. Sarah spent most of the morning on the phone, her voice hushed as she made calls to old contacts from her days at the circus. Emily listened from the hallway, straining to catch snippets of the conversations. She heard names she didn't recognize, phrases like, "He's still out there," and "We need protection." When Sarah finally hung up, her face was pale but determined. "I've reached out to someone who might be able to help us," she said, avoiding Emily's eyes. "Who?" Emily asked. "An old friend," Sarah replied vaguely. Emily didn't press further, but her curiosity burned. Another piece of the puzzle was being kept from her, and she was tired of waiting for answers. That afternoon, Emily went back to the basement, hoping to find something Sarah might have overlooked. She rifled through old boxes, photo albums, and papers, searching for anything that could provide more clarity about Whitaker or the ledgers. In one of the boxes, she found a stack of photographs wrapped in a yellowed piece of cloth. The first few were familiar, pictures of her mother and Arthur with the lion, Leonard. But as she flipped through them, the images became darker. One photo showed Whitaker standing next to a large cage, his expression cold and menacing. Another depicted a group of workers huddled together, their faces tense. And then there was a photo of a young woman Emily didn't recognize, her face partially obscured by shadows. On the back of the photo, someone had scrawled a single word: "Gone." Emily's stomach churned. Who was the woman, and what had happened to her? Before Emily could dwell on the photo for long, she heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. She quickly hid the photos back in the box and hurried upstairs. Through the window, she saw a sleek black car parked outside, a different one from the vehicle that had followed her earlier. A man stepped out, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the driveway. "Who is that?" Emily asked as Sarah joined her at the window. Sarah's face tightened. "That's the friend I told you about," she said. The man knocked on the door, and Sarah opened it cautiously. He stepped inside, his sharp features and piercing eyes immediately putting Emily on edge. "Hello, Sarah," the man said, his voice smooth but distant. "It's been a long time." "It has," Sarah replied, her tone guarded. "And this must be Emily," the man said, glancing at her with a faint smile. "I'm Tom. I worked with your mother at the circus." Emily didn't return the smile. Something about Tom felt off. The three of them sat in the living room, the ledgers laid out on the coffee table. Tom flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. "This is damning evidence," he said finally. "If this gets into the right hands, Whitaker is finished." "That's the plan," Sarah said. Tom leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah. "You realize he won't go down without a fight. If he knows you still have these, he'll come for you. He always does." "What do you mean, always?" Emily asked, her voice sharp. Tom hesitated, glancing at Sarah before answering. "Whitaker has a way of silencing people who cross him," he said. "People disappear. Accidents happen. You've seen it before, Sarah." Emily's pulse quickened. "Is that what happened to the woman in the photo?" she blurted out. Sarah and Tom exchanged a look. "What photo?" Sarah asked carefully. "The one I found in the basement," Emily said. "It had the word, 'Gone,' written on the back." Sarah's face darkened. "That's not your concern," she said. "It is my concern." Emily shot back. "How am I supposed to trust you when you keep hiding things from me?" Tom cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "The woman in the photo was Lena," he said. "She worked at the circus like your mother and me. She disappeared after Leonard escaped. No one knows what happened to her." "Whitaker," Emily said softly. Tom nodded. "Probably, but no one could prove it." As the conversation continued, Emily noticed a subtle shift in Tom's demeanor. He seemed too calm, too rehearsed, and the way he avoided certain questions only deepened her suspicions. Later that night, after Tom had left, Emily confronted her mother. "Can we trust him?" she asked. Sarah hesitated. "Tom has his flaws," she admitted, "but he's always been loyal. He helped me leave the circus when things went bad." "But what if he's working with Whitaker?" Emily pressed. Sarah's expression hardened. "He's not," she said firmly, "and you need to stop questioning everyone who tries to help us." Emily couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake, replaying the day's events in her mind. Something about Tom didn't sit right with her, but Sarah seemed convinced he was on their side. Just as she was starting to drift off, she heard a noise outside. It was faint, like the sound of footsteps on gravel. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She crept to her window and peered outside. First, she saw nothing. But then she noticed a figure standing near the edge of the yard, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. Emily's breath caught. The figure stood there for several seconds before disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, Emily told Sarah what she had seen. "It's him," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "He's getting closer." Emily clenched her fists. "We have to do something, Mom. We can't just sit here and wait for him to come to us." Sarah nodded, a determined look in her eyes. "You're right," she said. "It's time to end this." By midday, they were on the road, the ledgers packed safely in a bag at Sarah's feet. Emily didn't know where they were going, but she could feel the tension radiating from her mother. As they drove, Sarah glanced at the rearview mirror and frowned. "What's wrong?" Emily asked. "We're being followed," Sarah said, her voice tight. Emily turned to see a black car trailing them at a distance. It wasn't the same car as before, but it carried the same sense of menace. "Hold on," Sarah said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She took a sudden turn down a side street, then another, weaving through the back roads in an attempt to lose their pursuer. But the car stayed with them, its headlights glaring in the mirrors. Finally, Sarah pulled into an empty parking lot and killed the engine. She turned to Emily, her face pale but resolute. "Stay in the car," she said. "No way," Emily said. "I'm not leaving you alone." Before Sarah could argue, the other car pulled into the lot and came to a stop. The doors opened, and two men stepped out. Emily's breath caught as she recognized one of them. Tom. The stillness of the parking lot was suffocating as Sarah and Emily sat frozen in their car, staring at the two men stepping out of the black sedan. One of them was Tom, his expression calm yet unreadable. The other was a stranger, a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked hair and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. "That's him," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "That's Whitaker." Emily's heart pounded. For years, Whitaker had been nothing more than a shadowy figure in her mother's stories. But now he was here, standing just a few feet away. He looked every bit as imposing as Sarah had described, cold, calculating, and utterly unyielding. Whitaker approached their car, his footsteps deliberate and measured. Tom stayed back, leaning casually against the sedan, as if he had all the time in the world. "Sarah," Whitaker said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "You've caused me quite a bit of trouble over the years. I think it's time we had a little chat." Sarah opened the driver's side door but kept her hand on the steering wheel, ready to bolt if necessary. "I have nothing to say to you," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. Whitaker chuckled softly. "Oh, I think you do. But first," his gaze shifted to Emily, and his smile widened. "You must be Emily. I've heard so much about you." "Leave her out of this," Sarah snapped, stepping out of the car and positioning herself protectively in front of her daughter. Whitaker raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Sarah. I'm just here to talk." "Talk?" Sarah scoffed. "You've been stalking us, threatening us, and now you want to talk?" Whitaker's smile faded. "You took something that doesn't belong to you," he said, his tone hardening. "I want it back." Emily's mind raced. She glanced at Tom, hoping for some sign of reassurance, but he avoided her gaze. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Tom had led Whitaker to them. "You lied to us," Emily said, her voice shaking. "You're working with him." Tom finally looked at her, his face a mixture of guilt and defiance. "It's not what you think," he said. "It's exactly what I think," Sarah snapped. "You've been helping him this whole time, haven't you?" Tom sighed. "I didn't have a choice. You don't know what he's capable of." "Spare me the excuses," Sarah said. "You betrayed me, just like everyone else at the circus." Whitaker clapped his hands, drawing their attention back to him. "As much as I enjoy watching old friends argue, I'd like to get back to business. Hand over the ledgers, Sarah, and this all goes away." "And if I don't?" Sarah challenged. Whitaker's smile returned, colder this time. "Let's just say you won't like the alternative." Sarah glanced at Emily, her resolve hardening. "You'll never get them," she said. Whitaker's jaw tightened. "That's a shame," he said. He turned to Tom and nodded. "Take them." Tom hesitated, his eyes flicking between Whitaker and Sarah. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered. Whitaker's gaze darkened. "Do it or you'll regret it." Tom took a step forward, but Emily saw the reluctance in his movements. Desperation surged within her. "Tom, don't," she said. "You don't have to do this." For a moment, something flickered in Tom's eyes. Regret, perhaps, or guilt. But then he shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said, reaching for Sarah's arm. Before he could grab her, Sarah twisted away and slammed the car door into his side. The move caught him off guard, and he stumbled back with a grunt of pain. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. They sprinted across the parking lot, the sound of Whitaker's voice shouting orders behind them. Emily's legs burned as they ran toward a wooded area at the edge of the lot. "Don't stop," Sarah urged, her grip on Emily's hand tight. They plunged into the trees, the darkness swallowing them whole. Branches snagged at their clothes, and the ground was uneven, but they didn't slow down. Emily could hear the sound of footsteps behind them. Whitaker's men were following. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. Sarah stopped, her chest heaving as she looked around. "We need to keep moving," she said, but Emily grabbed her arm. "Mom, wait," she said, gasping for breath. "We can't keep running. We have to fight back." Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand." "No, you don't understand," Emily interrupted. "They're never going to stop. Whitaker will keep coming after us until we expose him. We have to use the ledgers. It's the only way." Sarah hesitated, her fear warring with the truth of Emily's words. Finally, she nodded. "You're right," she said. But we need help. They made their way back to the car cautiously, sticking to the shadows. When they arrived, the parking lot was empty. Whitaker and his men were gone, and so was Tom. Emily's stomach twisted. "Do you think he went back to Whitaker?" she asked. Sarah's expression was grim. "Probably," she said. "But that's not our biggest problem right now. We need to find someone who can take these ledgers and make sure Whitaker pays for what he's done." As they drove, Sarah made a series of phone calls, each one more desperate than the last. Finally, she got through to someone, a journalist she had known years ago. "I need your help," Sarah said, her voice tight with urgency. "I have something that could bring Whitaker down, but we're running out of time." The journalist agreed to meet them at a diner on the outskirts of town. Sarah hung up and looked at Emily. "This is our chance," she said. The diner was nearly empty when they arrived, its neon sign casting a faint glow over the parking lot. A man in his late 40s sat at a corner booth, his laptop open in front of him. "Sarah," he said, standing as they approached. "It's been a while." "Too long, Peter," Sarah replied. They sat down and Sarah slid the ledgers across the table. "This is everything you need," she said. "Whitaker's embezzlement, the bribes, the animal abuse. It's all in there." Peter flipped through the ledgers, his eyes widening as he read. "This is incredible," he said. "If this gets out, it'll destroy him." "That's the idea," Sarah said. But just as they began discussing how to proceed, the bell above the diner's door jingled. Emily turned to see Tom standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Tom," Sarah said, her voice tense. "What are you doing here?" Tom stepped closer, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I want to help," he said. Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I know where Whitaker is planning to strike next," Tom said. "And if we don't stop him, more people are going to get hurt." The air inside the diner felt heavy as Tom's words hung between them. Sarah sat stiffly in the booth, her gaze locked on the man she had once trusted but now regarded with thinly veiled contempt. Emily's heart pounded as she watched her mother weigh her next move. Tom took another cautious step closer, his hands still raised in a gesture of surrender. "I know I've given you every reason not to trust me," he said, his voice low but steady. "But I swear, I'm trying to make this right." Sarah's jaw tightened. "You led Whitaker to us," she said coldly. "You sold us out." "I didn't have a choice," Tom replied. "He threatened my family. But I'm here now, and I want to help." Emily couldn't contain her frustration. "How do we know you're not still working with him?" she demanded. Tom looked at her, his expression filled with something that almost resembled shame. "Because I know things that can stop him," he said. "I can tell you where he's keeping the rest of his records, the ones that will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he's guilty of everything in those ledgers and more." Sarah frowned, her eyes narrowing. "And why would he trust you with that information?" Tom hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "Because I've been his fixer for years," he admitted. "Whenever something went wrong, I was the one who cleaned it up. But I'm done. I can't keep living like this." Peter, the journalist, broke the tense silence. "If he's telling the truth, this could be huge," he said, flipping through the ledgers on the table. "These records are already enough to expose Whitaker. But if we can get our hands on more evidence, we could bury him." Sarah glanced at Emily, then back at Tom. "Where are these records?" she asked. Tom hesitated again, then leaned in closer. "There's a storage facility on the outskirts of town," he said. "Unit 37B. That's where he keeps the backups, contracts, bank statements, everything. He thinks no one knows about it, but I've been there. I've seen what's inside." Sarah's skepticism was evident. "And what's stopping you from walking right back to Whitaker the moment we get this evidence?" Tom met her gaze. "Because I'm done being his puppet," he said. "And because I owe you." Peter set down the ledgers and looked at Sarah. "We need to act fast," he said. "If Whitaker gets wind that you're planning to go public, he'll destroy whatever evidence he has left." Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. She didn't trust Tom, but she knew they couldn't afford to waste this opportunity. "Fine," she said finally. "But if you betray us again, I swear—" "I won't," Tom interrupted. "You have my word." They decided to move quickly, knowing that every second counted. Sarah and Emily followed Tom in their car while Peter stayed behind to begin drafting the story that would expose Whitaker. The drive to the storage facility was tense. The only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. Emily kept glancing at Tom's car ahead of them, her stomach twisting with unease. "Do you believe him?" she asked quietly. Sarah's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I don't know," she admitted. "But if there's even a chance he's telling the truth, we have to take it." The storage facility was located in a desolate area on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusting chain-link fences. The sun was setting as they arrived, casting long shadows over the rows of identical storage units. Tom parked his car and got out, motioning for Sarah and Emily to follow him. He led them to Unit 37B, then glanced around nervously before pulling a key from his pocket. "This is it," he said, unlocking the door. The metal door creaked loudly as it rolled up, revealing a dimly lit space filled with filing cabinets, cardboard boxes, and an old desk covered in papers. Emily's eyes widened as she took in the sight. "This is it?" she asked. Tom nodded. "This is where he keeps the stuff he can't risk storing anywhere else." Sarah stepped inside cautiously, her gaze sweeping over the room. "Start looking," she said. "We need anything that connects him to the crimes in the ledgers." For the next hour, they sifted through the contents of the unit. Emily found stacks of contracts with suspicious clauses, while Sarah uncovered bank statements showing massive transfers of money to offshore accounts. But it was a small, locked box in the corner that caught Emily's attention. She knelt down and examined it, noticing the initials GRW etched into the lid. "Mom," she called out. Sarah joined her, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the box. "Tom," she said, "what's in here?" Tom hesitated. "I'm not sure," he said. "I've never seen that before." Sarah didn't believe him, but she didn't have time to argue. She grabbed a crowbar from a nearby shelf and pried the box open. Inside was a stack of photographs along with a small notebook. Emily picked up one of the photos and froze. It showed Whitaker standing beside Lena, the woman from the photo she had found in the basement. But this time they weren't at the circus. They were standing in front of a lavish estate, their expressions cold and serious. Sarah flipped through the notebook, her brow furrowing as she read the entries. "These are records of payoffs," she said. "Bribes to city officials, hush money to employees. Everything." Emily's eyes widened. "This is it," she said. "This is what we need." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of footsteps outside made them freeze. Tom peeked out the door and cursed under his breath. "We've got company," he said. Sarah grabbed the notebook and the photos, stuffing them into her bag. "We need to get out of here," she said. They slipped out the back of the unit just as a group of men entered the facility. Emily's heart raced as they crouched behind a row of storage units, waiting for the men to pass. "Do you think they saw us?" Emily whispered. "I don't know," Sarah said, "but we can't stay here." As they made their way back to the car, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. They had the evidence they needed, but Whitaker wouldn't let them go without a fight. Tom led the way, his expression tense. "There's a back road that'll get us out of here," he said. "Follow me." They climbed into their car, Sarah gripping the wheel tightly as they followed Tom down the narrow dirt road. But as they rounded a bend, they saw a black SUV blocking the path ahead. Whitaker stepped out, flanked by two of his men. He smiled, a cruel, triumphant grin. "Going somewhere?" he asked. The dirt road stretched out in tense silence as Whitaker stood in front of the black SUV, flanked by two men whose expressions were as grim as their imposing stature. Sarah hit the brakes, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Turn around," Emily whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "There's no time," Sarah said, her voice low but steady. Her gaze was locked on Whitaker, who stood in the middle of the road like a predator toying with its prey. Tom stepped out of his car, his hands raised in an exaggerated gesture of surrender. "Whitaker," he called, his voice calm but edged with tension. "This isn't necessary. Let's talk." Whitaker smirked, his sharp eyes narrowing on Tom. "Talk? You've been talking plenty already. Haven't you, Tom? His voice was smooth, laced with venom. You think I don't know what you've been up to? Sarah opened her door and stepped out, clutching her bag tightly. If you want the ledgers, here they are, she said, her voice clear and defiant. But you're not getting away with this. Whitaker tilted his head, his smirk fading into a hard glare. Bold of you, Sarah, to think you're in any position to negotiate. Emily sat frozen in the car, watching the confrontation unfold. Her heart raced as she saw one of Whitaker's men step forward, his hand resting on something inside his jacket. She couldn't hear what they were saying over the roar of her own pulse, but she saw the tension in every movement, every word exchanged. Suddenly, Whitaker's voice cut through the air. Enough, he barked. Bring me the bag. Tom hesitated, glancing at Sarah before slowly stepping toward her. It's okay, he said softly. Let me handle this. But Sarah pulled the bag closer, shaking her head. No, she said firmly. If you hand this over, he'll destroy everything. Whitaker took a step forward, his expression darkening. Sarah, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You've already caused me enough trouble. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Emily couldn't stay in the car any longer. She threw open the door and ran to her mother's side. Stop! She yelled, her voice breaking. Just stop. Whitaker's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. Ah, he said, his smirk returning. The daughter. I've been wondering when you'd make your appearance. Leave her out of this, Sarah snapped. But Emily stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. Why are you doing this? She demanded, her voice trembling. What could possibly be worth all of this? Whitaker chuckled, a low, cold sound. You're a brave one, aren't you? He said. Maybe you should ask your mother that question. She's the one who started this. Emily turned to Sarah, tears brimming in her eyes. Mom, please, she said. What aren't you telling me? Sarah's face crumpled as she looked at her daughter. Emily, Enough! Whitaker interrupted, his voice sharp. I'm tired of this little family drama. Hand over the ledgers, Sarah, or what? A new voice cut in, sharp and commanding. Everyone turned to see Peter stepping out of his car, his phone held high. Everything you've said has been recorded, he said, his tone steady and authoritative. I've got enough evidence here to put you away for life, Whitaker. And if you make one wrong move, it's going straight to the police. Whitaker's smirk faltered, and for the first time, Emily saw a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Do you really think you can stop me with a recording? Whitaker sneered. I've dealt with bigger threats than you. Peter took a step closer, his eyes locked on Whitaker. Maybe, he said, but I'm betting you won't take that risk. The next moments were a blur. One of Whitaker's men lunged toward Peter, but Tom stepped in, shoving the man back with surprising force. The scuffle gave Sarah enough time to grab Emily and retreat toward the car. Get in, Sarah shouted, shoving Emily into the passenger seat. Before Sarah could climb in after her, Whitaker grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. You're not going anywhere, he growled. Sarah turned to face him, her eyes blazing with defiance. You've already lost, Whitaker, she said. The truth is out. Whitaker hesitated, his gaze darting between Sarah and Peter, who was still holding his phone. Slowly, his grip loosened. This isn't over, he said, his voice low and menacing. Yes, it is, Sarah replied. You just don't know it yet. The drive back to town was silent, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on everyone. When they reached Peter's office, Sarah handed over the ledgers, her hands trembling as she placed them on his desk. Are you sure this will be enough? She asked. Peter nodded. Between this and the recording, we have everything we need, he said. Whitaker won't be able to weasel his way out of this. Emily felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. But she also knew that the fight wasn't over. Whitaker might be on the brink of defeat, but he was still dangerous, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his threats than they realized. That night, as Emily and Sarah sat together on the couch, the weight of their ordeal finally hit them. Do you think it's really over? Emily asked softly. Sarah sighed. wrapping an arm around her daughter. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know one thing. We're not running anymore." Emily leaned into her mother's embrace, her heart heavy but filled with a new sense of determination. They had faced the shadows of their past and come out stronger. Whatever came next, they would face it together. In the days that followed, Peter's exposé on Whitaker made headlines across the country. The once powerful circus owner was arrested, his empire crumbling under the weight of his crimes. But for Emily and Sarah, the real victory was in the quiet moments of healing that followed. For the first time in years, their home felt like a place of safety and hope. And as they sat together one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Emily knew that they had finally found what they had been searching for all along: peace.